Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right, today we're going back to Harlem, to the 70s, and we're going to be talking about another Harlem legend. This man was super fly in the flesh. He went from customer to the biggest distributor in New York. He was the go-to guy for mafia importers. If he couldn't move your package, it was garbage. He built an organization based on the Italian mafia with him as the boss of bosses. His council, as he called it, flooded the streets of Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Anytime a customer needed it, he had it on the street for him. He wore expensive custom-made suits and drove Benzes, while most black dealers drove Cadillacs and dressed like pimps. He was the pusher man, Mr. Untouchable, but he would go on to do the unforgivable. I'm talking about Leroy Nicky Barnes. But before we get into that, if you're new here and you want to join the operation, first thing you got to do is you got to bump off that subscribe button. All right, that's how you make your bones. Second thing you got to do is you got to break that thumb. All right. Third thing you got to do is you got to ring that bell. Then you got to set it for all notifications so you don't miss nothing. All right. So before we get into this, I just want to tell you, I've been trying to get this video up for the last 5 days. So if you're watching this video right now, that means we successfully got past the YouTube cops. All right. So let's get into this. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born October 15th, 1933 in Harlem, New York. The Harlem of Nicky's youth was clean and full of respectable people. As a kid, Nicky ran the streets with his friends, making a few cents helping out fruit vendors on their horse-drawn carts. Him and his friends would live a carefree life on the streets. They would sleep on the roofs of buildings in the summer to keep cool and wake up and get day old buns from the bakery. His home life was a little more hectic. His father worked as a maintenance man, and his family lived rent-free in the building that he was responsible for. According to Nicky, his father was a flat-foot hustler. He had the maintenance job, as well as a job at the transit authority. He held a card game in the house and ran a few numbers, and he also sold low weed on the side, but he never had any money. Nicky stayed for a while at a red brick building at 8th and 115th, along with his parents and his sister. It was a small apartment. His mother would complain about the cramped conditions, and when his father got the opportunity to become a super at 375 Manhattan Avenue, she insisted he take the job and move the family there. Nicky soon began to hang out with a kid named Jackie Gomez. Jackie lived across the street from Nicky with his elderly grandmother, and the two became inseparable. It was Jackie who got Nicky into crime. Petty stuff at first, stealing empty beer and milk containers and returning them for nickels. Nicky got his first pinch before he was 10, when him and Jackie were in Times Square shining shoes and snatched a wad of cash from a drunk customer. They ran but were soon caught by police. Nicky was taken in. When his mother was called, she came to get him crying and said, "Nicky, you gotta be good." But she never told his father. He was known to be heavy-handed in the house. One of his father's jobs as a super was the mop. He would do the whole building, but Nicky and his sister would do the apartment. His father gave Nicky a key to the supply closet so he can get the mop and bucket when he needed it. One day, while in the closet, Nicky noticed the package. He peeked inside and saw what he recognized from the older kids' work. After sniffing some, he took the package outside and sold it in a matter of minutes. By age 12, Nicky was sniffing junk, but he was not yet a customer. He began to run with a street gang called the Turks. He was a tiny Turk, and he got his first weapon, a zip gun or a homemade gun. It was a metal pipe attached to a model airplane launcher, secured with tape. Zip guns were as dangerous to the shooter as the target, as Nicky would find out. Nicky's father was not happy with the new place. The old place paid him $30 a week, and the new place, although it was bigger, he only got the apartment and not the money. So he moved the family back to 8th and 115th Street, which caused friction between Nicky's parents. Nicky would often see his mother and father fighting, and when he jumped in, his father would smack him too. One night, Nicky came home to his parents arguing. Nicky wasn't having it. He told his father to leave her alone. His father said, "What are you going to do?" Nicky pulled his zip gun and said, "Back up, mother." His father didn't flinch. He said, "What is that?" Nicky said, "Come close and you'll find out what it is." "That ain't even a real gun. I'm going to kick your little ass." Nicky squeezed the trigger and the gun exploded in his hand. His father came at him, but Nicky jumped from the second floor window, catching a pole to slide down to the street and took off. Nicky told his gang what happened, and they approached his father outside of his job. One of the older gang members pulled a piece, this time a real one, and he aimed it at Nicky's father. He said, "If you ever put your hands on Nicky again, I'll blow your brains out." By this time, Nicky's friend Jackie was a full-blown customer. he decided that it would be a good time for him and Nicky to rob the den he frequented. They busted in with guns drawn and told everyone to get on the floor and demanded the money. They scored, but on the way out, the neighbor saw what was happening and tried to apprehend Nicky. Again, he jumped out the window, this time to a dead-end alley, but he was able to find the window open and crawled in. After his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he found a door and walked right out the front of the building. It was a man named Fat Herbie who gave Nicky his first package. He started off at a pool room near 118th and St. Nicholas. The spot was near Milton's Playhouse where top jazz performers would play. They would make their way around to the pool hall before gigs, and Nicky took care of them. Fat Herbie began to trust Nicky with more and more. He had Nicky cutting the work, packaging, and doing drops. You could say everything that happened in the future could be blamed on Fat Herbie because he sent Nicky to Pleasant Avenue. Pleasant Avenue was the mafia's hub, and it was Lucchese territory, and they had been bringing in work for a long time. They controlled the importation, but not the distribution. This was left up to the locals. Fat Herbie was one of those. Nicky pulled up to Pleasant Avenue and walked into the bakery and told the old man behind the counter that Fat Herbie sent him. The man returned with a brown bag and said, "Here you go, kid." Nicky became known as Fat Herbie's man on Pleasant Avenue. He went every week to pick up. Over time, a heavyweight on Pleasant Avenue named Big Frank Madonna introduced Nicky to his kid brother Matthew, known as Matty. This is the start of a partnership that will make both men multimillionaires down the road. But for now, Nicky was 17, and he was now a full-blown user. He was still working for Herbie, but his need for the stuff made him do stupid things. At 17, he was arrested for possession of a hypodermic. At 18, he was arrested for possession of burglary tools. And finally, at 19, he was arrested for breaking into cars and was sent to a reformatory. Without access, Nicky began to go through withdrawal. The cramps and sweats and sickness lasted for 10 days, during which he swore that when he got clean, he would never use again. But the day he made parole, he went right to a den and got $20 worth. He became a stick-up man, and on one of those stick-ups, he scored some work and some designer clothes. After selling the clothes and the work, he bought some work to sell, some weight. Nicky and his girlfriend started a little operation selling while still being users. He was bringing in about $1,600 a day. He hired some dealers to move his goods, and his cut was low and his quality was high. Soon, the name Nicky Barnes was ringing throughout the Harlem's user community. By 1959, Nicky's operation was doing well until his girlfriend ran into a friend she hadn't seen in a while. She told her girlfriend that she was dating Nicky Barnes. Her friend said, "Do you think I could buy some weight off him?" His girlfriend gave her friend the work, and in the middle of the night, cops busted Nicky's door down. They found needles, work, and money. Nicky was taken in and eventually found guilty of possession and sentenced to 5 years. In Greenhaven, Nicky again went through withdrawal. After a few months of good behavior, Nicky was transferred to a better section of the prison, where he ran into Matty Madonna, who was doing a bit for bumping off a Harlem dealer named Tank. The two reunited, and after a feeling out process, Matty and Nicky began to talk business. Matty schooled Nicky on how to be big time. He told him, "You gotta be 3 levels away from the work. You gotta be the don in your organization. Let your lieutenants handle the business and the soldiers handle the streets. Keep your hands clean." Matty introduced Nicky to his mafia pals at the joint. One of them, Sammy Katz, went all the way back to Arnold Rothstein and Waxy Gordon. Nicky hung around these mafia guys and absorbed the way they did business. When he got out this time, he would stay clean. His focus was on making money and not getting high. After 3 years, Nicky Barnes was released back into society. Before he left, Matty gave him a gift. He said that his brother Frank would give Nicky a half a key on consignment, money for a car and a stash house. 1963, Nicky set out to build his organization. He got a lieutenant and some muscle, and a woman he took from another dealer to run his mill. Now, Nicky was from the west side, but to give Big Frank his money on time, he had to put some work out on the east side. The only thing was, the east side was already run by a man named Steve Austin, not to be confused with the $6 million man. He didn't like Nicky selling on his turf. He approached Nicky one night and told him that. Nicky said, "Kiss my ass. I'm gonna put my gun up and beat you up and down the street." Nicky stashed his gun in the glove compartment, and the two-fought affair went to a draw until it was broken up. After this, Big Frank told Nicky he didn't need him dying over territory. He said, "Bring your people back across Lenox and put less cut on the next package." After a while, the customers flocked from the east side to the west, passing the east side dealers to get that Nicky Barnes package. Nicky realized the customer didn't care who was the toughest. They just wanted the best deal. And Nicky's work was that. Nicky's cut was so low, a person could buy a bag from him take it home and cut it, and make a whole nother bag. The New York Quarter. Soon, every wise guy on Pleasant Avenue wanted Nicky to handle their package, but he had a good thing going with Frank Madonna. Nicky felt like he had put together an unbreakable operation. He had 50 employees, and he was getting Frank his money on time. But on January 29, 1965, he was arrested in the Bronx. His lieutenant was also arrested, and the cops took him to Nickis Mill. The place was filled with thousands of glassine bags, cans of milk sugar used for cutting, boxes, and rubber bands. Oh yeah, and they also found $500,000 worth of work. 5,000 bags all ready for the streets, and another 6 keys ready for processing. One detective grabbed the key and said, "Here, Nick, catch." He instinctively caught it, and now his fingerprints were on the work. The police had been trailing Nicky for a month. This was part of a citywide crackdown on dealers. That same day, dealers from all over New York were arrested. Nicky happened to be one of them. When he got back to Greenhaven, him and Matty Madonna decided that it would be better if they were not seen together while they were doing time. But Matty wasn't the biggest mafioso in the joint. Joe Gallo was there, a Colombo family member. Joey was doing time for extortion, a case that had been in the courts for 10 years. After exhausting all appeals, Joey was sent to Greenhaven. Joey was a renegade mafioso. He had his own gang, and they went to war with the boss of the family, Joe Profaci, in the early 60s. But that's a different story for another video. Unlike a lot of mafioso, Joey had no problem with associating and doing business with gangsters of other races. He befriended Nicky, and the two would play chess. Joey would give Nicky tips on how to beat the mafia and take control of the neighborhoods. Joey felt like the old-timers had gotten fat and were not hungry like him and Nicky. Nicky absorbed what Joey had to say, but he was not willing to be a pawn in this game. After 2 years, the drug case was thrown out because it was found that the police performed an illegal search and Nicky was back on the streets. This time, he decided he was going to stay out of the powder game. In the joint, he had converted to Islam, and it was the beginning of the Black Power movement. Nicky felt like he should be involved. But when he went to go check out the Panthers in Harlem, he didn't feel like it was a fit. These guys were dedicated, but they were broke. Nicky had become accustomed to the finer things, the cars, the clothes, and the women, and his name was still ringing. Frank Madonna was not an option because he was doing time. Two of Nicky's former associates, though, Reggie Isaacs and a man named Stan, had become big in the powder game. When the supplier found out that they knew Nicky, he wanted to meet him. Nicky left the meeting with a new connect. He set it up like before. He would run all the work through Reggie and Stan and insulate himself from the operation. Business was booming. The trio were making $150,000 every 10 days. But after a few months of this, Stan and Reggie said they wanted to retire. Nicky was shocked, but you can't stop a man from doing what they think is best. It was at this time, Nicky decided that he needed to build his own family. He would get together some of the street's best dealers and form an organization that would flood the streets of New York. The first man on his team would be a former adversary, Frank James. Frank James was a former stick-up man who had robbed some of Nicky's workers in the past. The two played a cat-and-mouse game, Nicky being the cat, hunting Frank the mouse. But Frank and Nicky had a similar street IQ, and he was always able to escape Nicky's attempt to kill him. Frank was a big, imposing guy, and he had a fierce rep on the streets of Harlem. Ishmael Muhammad was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he would be the spiritual guidance the gang needed. Nicky's dream was to use Islam as a binding force for black criminals like Catholicism was for Italians. Wally Rice was a former numbers runner who turned to powder after being pushed out of the numbers game by the Cubans. He turned his earnings into real estate and made big money. He would be the business expert the crew could use to eventually go legit. Thomas Foreman, better known as Gaps, a tough guy from Brooklyn. The council stashed his money in his apartments in Brooklyn. He would be the treasurer. Joseph Jazz Hayden, fresh out of the joint. He was known as a hustler, and he would be in charge of getting the crew's cutting agent, quinine. These men were all in their 40s. The last member of the team was a 20-something named Guy Fisher, Sugar Pie Guy. He was a tall, slim, good-looking guy who all the ladies in Harlem loved. But he was a hustler to the core, and he had no problem doing the violent things that needed to be done to remain on top in the game. This was the council. Each man had a role. They had what Nicky considered a solemn oath that would be said before each meeting. With the men holding hands in a circle, each man would recite one word of the oath. Treat my brother as I treat myself. At this time, the streets were dry. The French Connection had been destroyed, and a fresh home from Greenhaven, Matty Madonna, planned to fill the void. He knew exactly who he wanted to be as distributor. Nicky and Matty met and ironed out a system that would keep them both insulated and protected. Maddie would fill a car with work and have it placed on the street somewhere in New York or New Jersey. Maddie would give Nicky the key to the car and the location. Nicky would turn the key over to his lieutenant, a former lieutenant for Reggie Isaac's name, Kurt Millett. Kurt would retrieve the car and take it to the council's mill, where women worked in the nude so they didn't steal. They would work sometimes 12-hour shifts to cut and package the work for street sale. After they were done, the house was vacuumed and the air conditioning filters were replaced because powder residue covered everything. The women got dressed, got paid, and left. Kurt took 7 bags and gave them to each member's lieutenant to be distributed on the street. After the money was collected, a key was given to Maddie to a car containing the money, and the cycle continued week after week. On December 9, 1972, the body of Reggie Isaacs was found bullet-ridden and stuffed into the trunk of a 1972 Lincoln Continental near Gun Hill Road in the Bronx. It seems Reggie had a shipment he was responsible for, and it got hijacked. A few days later, his body was found. Now, Nicky denies involvement, but I caught Nicky in a few untruths doing my research, so take that with a grain of salt. The streets were saturated with Nicky's work. The cops knew who was in charge but couldn't bust Nicky. He was too far away from the action. But a law was passed in the early 1970s that would change that rule. It would even the playing field for the authorities. The RICO Act was a result of the McClellan hearings in the 1950s and 60s. The government realized that under the current laws of prosecution, they would never be able to get the main players in organized crime because they were not directly responsible for the crime, but they were the facilitators. They called the shots, but didn't pull the trigger. By 1973, Nicky was under constant surveillance. Even his apartment doorman was an undercover agent assigned to keep tabs on him. But he didn't care. They couldn't put anything on him. Nicky stayed in a 7-bedroom penthouse with his girl Thelma Grant, or T, and a couple's daughter at 100 Haven Avenue in Washington Heights. On August 30th, 1973, the police came into the garage of the building with drug-sniffing dogs. When the dogs got near Nicky's 1973 Mercedes-Benz, they gave the bark that indicated drugs were or had been present. They got a warrant from a judge and were knocking on Nicky's door. But after a 6-month investigation, the police only found an ounce of grass, a shotgun, and a few handguns. Nicky and T were arrested for possession of a dangerous drug and possession of weapons. They were taken in, and Nicky was held on $75,000 bail that was reduced to $15,000. When the case went to trial, Nicky's lawyer had the drug-sniffing dogs brought into court. He had them sniff around the box that he had brought in, and they gave off the same bark that indicated the presence of drugs. But when the lawyer opened the box, it was only a bottle of aspirin. The case was dismissed. In the spring of '74, Nicky's lieutenant, Kurt Millett, came to Nicky and told him that his girlfriend ran off with $25,000 of Nicky's money, and he didn't know where she was. Kurt loved this woman, and she betrayed him, but business was business, and Nicky wanted his money back. Kurt told Nicky he knew where her brother lived. He asked Nicky to come with him. Nicky agreed that everything would go smoother if he was there. But in his book, Mr. Untouchable, Nicky says that, for the record, he told Kurt no, and he didn't go. But I know otherwise. On March 8, 1974, Kurt and Nicky knocked on the door of Clifford Haynes, the brother of Kurt's girlfriend, who lived at 976 Simpson Street in the Bronx. Kurt knocked on the door. "Hey, it's Kurt and Nicky. I'm not strapped. We just want to talk." Haynes opened the door and talked tough through the chain. "Well, I am strapped. Now get the hell away from my door." Kurt bust the door down and grabbed Haynes and began to punch and kick him. "Where is she?" I don't know," Clifford said. "They left and they haven't called me." Kurt wasn't convinced. He pulled the gun from his waistband, but Nicky vetoed the shooting. He said it would bring too much attention. So Kurt grabbed the plastic bag and put it over Haynes' face and said in his ear, "I want my mother and money." Haynes fought back, and Kurt had to stab him in the chest with a stiletto. Nicky and Kurt left Haynes to bleed to death, but he was able to make it to the hospital and named Kurt and Nicky as his assailants before succumbing to his wounds. Kurt was arrested first, and Nicky was arrested a few weeks later on May 11, 1974 in his penthouse and was charged with murder. He was held on $100,000 bail. Nicky was ranked number 6 out of 100 in the city moving weight. He funneled money through a preacher to try to get him out on bail. But the prosecution saw right through this. The problem was that the Samuel's Temple of the Church of God only had $334 in their account. The pastor then removed $50,000 from a safety deposit box and tried to pay Nicky's bail. Again, it was denied. Finally, a Detroit bail bondsman came up and paid Nicky's bail. On June 10, 1974, Nicky's picture appeared in the New York Daily News as one of the leaders of the Black Mafia. This was the media's attempt to make sense of the rise of the black gangster. In reality, all these men were independent of each other and had their own gangs. In fact, Nicky doesn't even mention Frank Matthews at all in his book. But again, that's for another video. But for now, Nicky was free and back on the streets. The council was running like a well-oiled machine. On December 18, 1974, Nicky was riding in his rented Mercedes along with his muscle, Richard Smith, known as Big Smitty. Smitty was 6'4", 6'5", well over 350 pounds. And another man named Bobby Monroe, an ex-con friend of Nicky's who was also a big guy. The trio was pulled over on a routine stop in the Bronx. When the police told the men to exit, a .38 caliber pistol fell out. The cops found more weapons in the car. Nicky offered the cops $25,000 to let him and his companions walk. The offer was raised to $150,000, the amount police found in a brown paper bag stuffed into the back seat cushion. On May 8, 1975, a jury found Nicky not guilty of bribery. The summer of 1975, a guy named Mikey Puglisi approached Jazz and told him that he had powder better than Madonna's. The council got a sample and it tested great. They put together $250,000 and got a package. A few days after the work was on the streets, the brothers came back and said that it was not selling. The customers would call it garbage. Mikey had sold them synthetic. Synthetic work tested good in the chemical test, but the quality dropped when it was cut. They demanded the money back, but Mikey only gave them $200, kept the $50 and left town. Later that year, Nicky and Kurt were acquitted of the death of Clifford Hayes. That July, Mikey Puglisi made a return. He said that he had the $50,000 he owed them and a key of pure work on consignment as a show of faith. Nicky and the council smelled a rat. They were right. Mikey was working for the feds and he had to go. One problem with this is Mikey Puglisi was connected with Carmine Galante. Galante was a heavyweight in the Bonanno family. He was Joe Bonanno's man. In the 40s, he went to Europe and established a smuggling ring that brought in tons of work from Marseille through Canada and into the States. He had a reputation as a killer. He had a reputation as a savage killer. He did 25 years on a drug charge and was now back on the streets. Nicky went to Matty, and Matty told him that Mikey was Galante's guy, and they should check with him first before doing anything. Nicky said, "I don't need Galante's approval to spark someone." Nicky said, if Galante wants a war, he'll have his reason in 24 hours. The next morning, the flaming body of Mikey Puglisi was dumped outside of a hospital. He was shot several times, the barrel so close to him that the muzzle flash set his clothes on fire. Nicky and his boys prepared to hit the mattresses. But Matty said he didn't think that Galante would do anything. Nicky was too valuable. Nicky was disappointed. Late in 1975, Matty Madonna sent two of his men to Florida to pick up a shipment. But the DEA was waiting for them, and they flipped. They brought the work back to New York, and when his man gave Matty the key to the car, helicopters and DEA agents swarmed in, and Matty was arrested and sent away for 30 years. With all his cases done, Nicky had time to have some fun. Even though he was married, or at least living in common law with his woman, T, Nicky met a young woman named Shemeka. Shemeka was beautiful, less than 20 years old, and Nicky was in his 40s. And it wasn't long before Shemeka had the drug law wrapped around her finger. Soon she had all the latest clothes and fashions. Nicky gave her a Benz and put her in an apartment, and she began to call herself Shema Barnes. With Matty Madonna gone, the council needed a new source. They started using a Cuban importer, but the product wasn't the same quality, and it took longer to process. Jazz came to Nicky and said that a guy named Louis D was introduced to him by a low-level member named Geronimo. He said that Louis D was a renegade mafioso from Joey Gallo's old neighborhood. He had been out in California, but he was back. Jazz told Nicky that Louis said he can get him anything from a key to a Sherman tank. He also told Jazz that he had a big shipment coming in and that the council could have the whole thing. Just one thing. Louis had some big clients who needed something right now, and the stuff wasn't in yet. He asked Jazz could he front him a couple keys. Louis also told Jazz that he could change some small bills into big bills for him as a show of faith. Nicky smelled a rat. He grabbed Jazz and said, if he has all this stuff, why does he need anything from us? But it was too late. Jazz had already given Louis the money to change. Nicky's instincts were right. Louis D was a federal agent. When Jazz wanted to change his money, Louis had a recorder rolling. At first, Jazz kept the conversation away from work, but Louis kept saying that when he got his stuff from Jazz's man, it was no good. Then Jazz said, you should have come to me. I would have made sure you were okay. A few days later, Nicky was driving through Harlem when he noticed he was being tailed. This was nothing new. Nicky was used to surveillance. He had been being watched for years. At his birthday party in 1975, the FBI had agents posing as waiters, all of them talking to the microphones under their trays. But this felt different. Nicky pulled his Volvo over and went into a bar and handed the bartender his pistol and told the guy, "Hold this for me." He didn't know the man, but he was Nicky Barnes, and no one in Harlem would deny his request. Nicky went back outside and got into his car. He drove a few blocks until he was surrounded by cop cars and a helicopter flying rooftop high in Harlem. Nicky was arrested that day as a part of an operation to cripple his organization. 24 of his men, including Jazz and Guy, were arrested. $313,000, $1 million in work, several firearms and expensive cars were seized. Nicky was arrested and charged with operating a continuous criminal organization. He made bail a few weeks later and was on the streets while he awaited trial. While he waited, Nicky received a phone call that would be his undoing. A writer from the New York Times magazine called Nicky and told him that they were doing a story on him, and they wanted him to pose for a photo shoot. Nicky declined. The reporter then threatened to use Nicky's mugshot, taking the night he was arrested for the murder of Clifford Haynes. No way did Nicky want the potential jurors to see that mugshot, so he agreed to do the shoot. Nicky wanted potential jurors to see him as a businessman, not as a dealer. So he picked out a nondescript, off-the-rack, wash-and-wear denim suit and a red, white, and blue tie. Nicky thought that he looked like any other businessman. But when the magazine hit the stand, it had Mr. Untouchable in bold red letters right next to his face. Whatever image Nicky thought he portrayed went out the window with that caption. The cover went on to say, "This is Nicky Barnes. The police say he may be Harlem's biggest dealer, but can they prove it?" This was not good. Here he was, on the cover of the New York Times magazine, looking like he was thumbing his nose to law enforcement. One person who saw it that way was President Jimmy Carter. He read the article and called the Attorney General, and he told him that this was the biggest case in America. No one can be seen to be above the law. So like Herbert Hoover in the 30s with Al Capone, Carter instructed the Justice Department to get Nicky Barnes. When Nicky's trial began, the defense was informed that there would be an anonymous jury, the first in U.S. history. They would not know the names or addresses of the potential jurors. The trial started in mid-September of 1977. On October 21st, 1977, Reverend Samuel Wyndham, the pastor who tried to bail Nicky out a few years back, was shot in the head at 2 a.m. after an argument in a social club. This was not associated with Nicky's trial. He wasn't even scheduled to appear. On December 3rd, 1977, Nicky Barnes appeared in court to hear the verdict. Nicky was found guilty of operating a large criminal organization. Jazz and 3 others were also found guilty. Guy Fisher could not be found guilty in a hung jury. The judge ordered Nicky's bail revoked, and he was taken into the custody of U.S. Marshals and taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. He would eventually be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Nicky went off to do his time. The end. Or it should have been. The council's remaining members kept the business going over the next few years. But Nicky's cut became smaller and smaller. His lawyers were not being paid on time. It seems like everyone had forgotten about him and everything that he did for them. The final straw came when Nicky found out that both of his women, T and Shema, had moved on. Nicky expected they would, but the problem was who they moved on with. Out of the millions of men in New York, they both hooked up with former partners of Nicky's. T was seen riding in the passenger seat of Nicky's white Benz. A snow dealer named Tito was driving it. Tito and Nicky had been friends. But Shema was sleeping with Guy Fisher, and this was a violation of the council rules. A member's woman was off limits. Nicky's ego couldn't take it. He wanted to get back at those people who he felt had did him wrong. Nicky told Frank James to hit Guy Fisher. But after months of Frank dragging his feet, Nicky realized that he was no longer respected as the leader. He was in a joint for life. Nicky began to think that if he couldn't run the council, he could damn sure wreck it. In November 1982, Nicky gave T permission to deal with a man who turned out to be a federal agent. She was arrested, and he did the same with Shema. She was also arrested for selling to a federal agent. Then Nicky made a call to the feds, and he started talking council business. This sent waves through the underworld. Nicky was a threat, not just to his own organization, but to the mafia and all the dealers in New York and around the country. On December 13, 1982, Shema, whose real name was Beverly Ash, was out on bail when she walked into a bar at 3800 Broadway near 159th Street in the Bronx. 3 men were sitting at a bar when she came in, and when she sat down, One of them got up and pulled the gun and shot Shemeka 3 times in the neck. The killer walked down and escaped. Shemeka was taken in an ambulance to the hospital, but was dead on arrival. Nicky flipped on the counsel. He testified against Guy Fisher and Frank James, sending them to jail for life without parole. T received 5 years, but Nicky was not done. He went on to testify against 50 dealers around the country, sending them to prison as well. In 1988, Nicky had his sentence reduced to 35 years. And in 1998, he was released from federal prison and was put into the witness protection program. Nicky would go on to do interviews, show little remorse for his lifestyle, his actions, nor did he show any feeling toward the death of Shemeka. Leroy Nicky Barnes died of cancer on June 18, 2012. His name still rings bells in Harlem, but now for all the wrong reasons. And that, my friends, is the story of Leroy Nicky Barnes. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Remember, you want to join the crew, you got to bump off that subscribe button, break that thumb, ring that bell, and if you want to slide an envelope upstairs to the boss to help the channel run smooth, the link is down below. I want to take this time to thank everyone who donated last month. I'm going to get some type of thing where I can show your names. If you want your names, if you don't want your names, tell me. I won't do that either. I won't do that if you don't want your name up there. If you want to be anonymous, we can do that too. All right. But I want to thank everybody who donated last month. You guys helped the channel run smooth, and you helped get the videos out quicker. Even though I was trying to get this video out for 5 days, blame it on YouTube. All right. So this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see yous in the funnies.